Awkward silences, forced smiles, the slow realization that whoever set you up had no idea who you actually were. But his sister had insisted, practically begged, and Nolan had made the mistake of thinking maybe this time would be different. It wasn't. The waiter drifted past again, a thin man with slicked back hair and a practiced look of pity. "Still waiting, sir?" "Yeah." Nolan didn't look up. "Just a few more minutes." The waiter nodded and moved on, leaving Nolan alone with his water glass and the growing certainty that he'd been stood up. Again. He pulled out his phone, checked the message thread one more time. Nothing new, just his sister's text from this morning. "Her name's Monica. She's great. You'll love her. 8 p.m. at Marcello's. Don't bail." He hadn't bailed. Monica had. Nolan exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. This was what his life had become. Squeezing failed dates into the narrow gaps between work and parenting, hoping something would click, knowing it probably wouldn't. At 32, he was too tired for this, too stretched. His day started at 5 in the morning and ended whenever his son finally fell asleep, and somewhere in between he was supposed to find time to be a person, to want things, to build something that wasn't just survival. He flagged down the waiter. "Can I get the check?" "You didn't order anything, sir." "Right." Nolan stood, pulling a few bills from his wallet and dropping them on the table anyway. "For your trouble." The waiter pocketed the cash without comment, and Nolan headed for the door, weaving between tables of couples and families who all seemed to have their lives figured out in ways he didn't. He pushed through the front entrance into the cool October air, loosening his tie as he walked. The street was busy, headlights cutting through the dusk, people moving with the kind of purpose Nolan used to have before his life got complicated. His truck was parked 2 blocks over, but he wasn't ready to go home yet. His son, Tyler, was with Nolan's mother for the night, which meant Nolan had a few hours of silence ahead of him, a rare gift he didn't know what to do with. Going home to an empty apartment felt worse than sitting alone in a restaurant, so he kept walking, hands in his pockets, letting the city move around him. He turned a corner and nearly collided with a woman in a charcoal blazer, her phone pressed to her ear, her expression tight with frustration. "I don't care what the inspector said," she snapped into the phone. "If the permits aren't ready by Monday, we're finished. Do you understand that? Finished." Nolan stepped aside, muttering an apology she didn't acknowledge. She swept past him, heels clicking on the pavement, her voice fading into the noise of the street. He watched her go, then shook his head and kept moving. 2 more blocks, and he found himself standing outside a place he hadn't noticed before. A small bar tucked between a dry cleaner and a shuttered bookstore, its sign barely visible in the fading light. The Iron Tap. The name was painted in faded gold letters above a door that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Nolan hesitated, then pushed it open. Inside, the bar was quiet and dimly lit, the kind of place that catered to regulars and didn't care about attracting anyone new. A handful of people sat scattered along the bar, nursing drinks and staring at their phones. Nolan slid into an empty booth near the back, away from the door, and a waitress appeared almost immediately. A woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a practiced smile. "What can I get you?" "Whiskey. Neat." She nodded and disappeared, returning a minute later with a glass that she set down in front of him without ceremony. Nolan thanked her, took a sip, and let the burn settle in his chest. The whiskey was cheap but effective, and for the first time all night, he felt himself relax. He pulled out his phone again, scrolling through messages he'd already read. His sister had texted twice more, asking how the date went. He ignored her. Tyler had sent a photo of himself holding a drawing he'd made at his grandmother's house, a crooked stick figure labeled Dad, standing next to a smaller stick figure labeled Me. Nolan smiled despite himself, saved the photo, and set the phone down. He was halfway through his drink when someone slid into the booth across from him. Nolan looked up, startled, and found himself staring at a woman he didn't recognize. She was around his age, maybe younger, with dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail and sharp green eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in days. She wore a blazer over a wrinkled blouse, and her hands were folded on the table in front of her, fingers laced together like she was trying to keep herself from falling apart. "You're late," she said. Nolan blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said you're late." Her voice was clipped, impatient. "We agreed on 8:30. It's almost 9. "I think you've got the wrong person." She frowned, pulling out her phone and scrolling through something on the screen. "Nolan Pierce, structural engineer. You came highly recommended. Nolan set his glass down slowly. I'm a structural engineer, yeah, but I didn't agree to meet anyone tonight. The woman stared at him, her frown deepening. You didn't get my email? I don't know who you are. She exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through her hair. This is unbelievable. I sent 3 emails. 3. Did you even check? Lady, I think there's been a mix-up. Clearly. She leaned back in the booth, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, she looked less angry and more exhausted. So you're not the contractor I hired? No. Great. That's just great. She pulled out her phone again, typing something furiously. I don't have time for this. I'm supposed to meet someone who can actually help me, and instead I'm sitting here talking to someone who didn't ask to be here, Nolan finished. Look, I don't know what you're dealing with, but I'm not your guy. You want a contractor, try Yelp. She stopped typing and looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then she sighed, rubbing her temples. I'm sorry, that was rude. This whole thing is falling apart, and I don't know what I'm doing. Nolan should have left, should have stood up, finished his drink, and walked out the door. But something in her voice stopped him, something raw and unguarded that reminded him of the way he'd felt a year ago when his ex-wife left and he realized he was going to raise their son alone. What's falling apart? He asked. She hesitated, then pulled a tablet from her bag and set it on the table between them. The screen showed a series of blueprints, old ones by the look of them, scanned and digitized but still faded around the edges. Nolan recognized the layout immediately. Industrial, early 20th century, probably a factory or warehouse. My father's ironworks, she said. It's been condemned. I've got 60 days to fix it or the city tears it down. Nolan leaned forward, studying the blueprints. What kind of issues are we talking about? Structural damage? The inspector flagged the foundation, the support beams, the roof. Pretty much everything. She scrolled through the images, showing him photos of the building. Rusted metal, cracked concrete, windows boarded up with plywood. I hired a contractor 2 weeks ago, but he bailed, said it wasn't worth the headache. Smart guy. Her eyes flashed. I'm not tearing it down. I didn't say you should. Then what are you saying? Nolan took another sip of his whiskey, considering. The blueprints were a mess. Layers of additions and modifications that had been slapped onto the original structure over decades, none of them properly integrated. But underneath all that chaos, he could see the bones of something solid, something worth saving. I'm saying it's going to cost you a fortune, he said, and even then there's no guarantee the city will sign off on it. I don't care what it costs. You should. She leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. My father built that place from nothing. It's the only thing I have left of him. I'm not letting some developer buy it for pennies and turn it into condos. Nolan studied her face, the set of her jaw, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table. She wasn't bluffing. This wasn't about money or business. This was personal. Who's the developer? He asked. Marcus Hale. Ever heard of him? Nolan hadn't, but the name sounded expensive. What's he offering? Doesn't matter. I'm not selling. Even if you can't fix it? Her jaw tightened. I'll fix it. Nolan looked at the blueprints again, tracing the lines with his eyes. There was a problem here, something the contractor she'd hired must have missed. He zoomed in on the foundation, then on the main support columns, and that's when he saw it. This beam, he said, pointing to a section of the blueprint. It's load-bearing, right? According to the original plans, yes. Then you've got a bigger problem than the inspector knows about. She frowned. What do you mean? Nolan turned the tablet toward her, tapping the screen. See this modification? Someone added a second floor here, probably in the 50s or 60s. But they didn't reinforce the beam underneath. They just built on top of it. So? So that beam is holding twice the weight it was designed for. And if it's as corroded as the rest of the building, it could fail. When it does, the whole second floor comes down. The color drained from her face. Are you serious? Dead serious. She stared at the screen, her hands trembling slightly. The inspector didn't say anything about that? He probably didn't catch it. Most inspectors don't dig this deep unless they have a reason to. But you did. It's what I do. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Nolan saw something shift in her expression, Surprise, maybe, or hope. What if I hired you? Nolan shook his head. I'm not a contractor. But you're an engineer. You could oversee the work. I've got a full-time job. And a kid. I'll pay you. I don't need your money. Then what do you need? The question hung in the air between them, and Nolan realized he didn't have an answer. What did he need? More time? More sleep? A life that didn't feel like it was constantly on the verge of collapse? I need to go home, he said finally, sliding out of the booth. She stood too, blocking his path. Wait, just wait. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pressure you. I don't know who else to ask. Nolan looked at her, at the desperation in her eyes, and felt something crack inside him. He thought about Tyler's drawing, about the stick figures standing side by side, and he thought about the life he was trying to build for his son. A life that wasn't just survival, but something more, something that mattered. What's your name? He asked. Celeste. Celeste Arden. Nolan Pierce. I know. She smiled faintly. You said... He pulled out his phone, opening a new contact. Give me your number. I'll take a look at the building tomorrow. No promises. Her face lit up. Really? Really? But if it's as bad as I think it is, I'm walking away. Deal? Deal. She rattled off her number and he saved it, then headed for the door. Celeste followed him, still talking, something about meeting at the site at noon, but Nolan wasn't really listening anymore. He was thinking about the blueprints, about the beam that was holding up a building it wasn't designed to support, and he was wondering why the hell he'd just agreed to get involved. Outside, the air was colder now, sharp enough to sting. Nolan pulled his jacket tighter and started walking, and he didn't look back. The ironworks sat on the east side of the city, tucked between a rail yard and a stretch of abandoned warehouses that looked like they hadn't seen life in decades. Nolan pulled up in his truck just before noon the next day, parking on the gravel lot out front. The building loomed above him, 4 stories of rusted metal and cracked brick, its windows dark and empty like the eyes of something long dead. Celeste was already there, standing near the front entrance with her arms crossed, her breath misting in the cold air. She waved when she saw him, and Nolan grabbed his toolkit from the back of the truck and walked over. You're late, she said. Traffic. Sure. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Come on, I'll show you inside. The front door was padlocked, but Celeste had a key. She unlocked it and pushed it open, and the smell hit Nolan immediately. Rust and mildew, and something deeper, something that reminded him of decay. He stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The interior was worse than the photos had suggested. The floor was littered with debris, chunks of concrete, broken glass, pieces of metal that had fallen from the ceiling. The walls were streaked with water damage, and the air was thick with dust. Overhead, the support beams groaned faintly, shifting under their own weight. Jesus, Nolan muttered. Yeah. Celeste walked ahead of him, picking her way carefully through the rubble. It's bad. I know. Bad doesn't cover it. She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. Can it be saved? Nolan didn't answer right away. He moved deeper into the building, running his hands along the walls, testing the beams, checking the foundation. He pulled out a flashlight and shone it into the corners, looking for cracks, for signs of movement, for anything that would tell him how close this place was to falling apart. And then he found it. The beam he'd seen on the blueprints was in the northeast corner, partially hidden behind a makeshift wall someone had built decades ago. Nolan pulled the wall down piece by piece until the beam was fully exposed. It was worse than he had expected, corroded almost all the way through, the metal flaking away like old paint. This is it, he said quietly. Celeste appeared at his shoulder, staring at the beam. Can you fix it? Not alone. Then we'll hire a crew. Celeste, this isn't just about hiring people. This is going to take months, maybe longer. I don't care. Nolan turned to face her. You should. Because if this beam fails before we can replace it, people could die. Her face went pale, but she didn't back down. Then we'll work fast. It's not that simple. Why not? Because I've got a kid, a job, a life that doesn't include spending every night in a condemned building. Then don't spend every night. Just help me get started. Nolan opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. There was something in her eyes, something fierce and stubborn and completely reckless, that reminded him of himself, of the way he'd felt when his ex left, when he'd decided he was going to raise Tyler alone, no matter what it cost him. "What's in this for you?" he asked. "What do you mean? You're a billionaire. You could buy 10 buildings like this. Why does this one matter?" Celeste looked away, her jaw tight. "My father started with nothing. He built this place with his own hands, and when he died, he left it to me. Not because I deserved it, but because he thought I could keep it alive." She swallowed hard. "I'm not going to prove him wrong." Nolan was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right, I'll help you, but I'm not doing this for free. I'll pay you whatever you want. I don't want money. I want materials, tools, and meals. You cover that, and I'll get this place standing." Celeste stared at him, then nodded slowly. "Deal." They shook on it, and Nolan felt the weight of the decision settle over him like a coat he couldn't take off. He didn't know if he was making the right choice. He didn't know if this building could be saved, or if Celeste's dream was worth the risk. But he knew one thing. He was tired of walking away. And for the first time in a long time, he wanted to see what happened if he stayed. The first week was hell. Nolan showed up every evening after work, his body already aching from 10 hours on a commercial site across town, and spent another 4 inside the ironworks doing the kind of labor that didn't show up on blueprints. Clearing debris, shoring up weak points, mapping out every crack and fissure in the foundation so he'd know what they were dealing with when the real work started. Celeste was there every night, working alongside him without complaint, her expensive clothes slowly accumulating layers of dust and rust that no dry cleaner was going to fix. She didn't talk much at first. Neither did he. They worked in a kind of exhausted silence, the only sounds the scrape of metal on concrete and the occasional groan of the building settling around them. But on the 4th night, as Nolan was prying up a section of rotted flooring near the main support column, Celeste finally broke. "Why are you really doing this?" Nolan didn't look up. "I told you, materials and meals." "That's not a reason. That's barely even payment." He set down his crowbar and straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth would be nice." Nolan studied her face in the dim work light they'd strung up along the walls. She looked tired. More than tired, actually. She looked like someone who'd been running on fumes for so long she'd forgotten what rest felt like. "I've got a son," he said finally. "Tyler. He's 7. His mom left when he was 5, and I've been doing this alone ever since, working double shifts, scraping by, trying to give him something stable." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I spent 2 years telling myself that was enough, that survival was the same thing as living. And then I met you, and you were fighting for something that mattered, and I guess I wanted to see what that felt like." Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard." "Yeah, well, welcome to my life." "I didn't mean it like that." She sat down on a stack of old pallets, her shoulders sagging. I get it. The survival thing. My father died 3 years ago, and I inherited everything, the company, the estate, the ironworks. And all of it came with conditions, trusts and legal restrictions and board members who think I'm too young to know what I'm doing. She laughed bitterly. "They're probably right. You're here, aren't you?" "So are you." Nolan picked up the crowbar again, turning it over in his hands. "My ex used to say I had a savior complex, that I couldn't walk past a problem without trying to fix it. Is that what this is? You trying to save me?" "No, I think you're trying to save yourself. I'm just holding the ladder." Something shifted in her expression then, something softer, more open. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For staying." Nolan nodded and went back to work, but the words stayed with him long after she'd gone home for the night. By the 2nd week, they'd cleared enough debris to start the real assessment. Nolan brought in a structural engineer he trusted, a gruff older man named Ray, who'd worked with him on half a dozen projects over the years. Ray spent 2 days crawling through the building with a clipboard and a laser level, taking measurements and shaking his head at regular intervals. "Well?" Nolan asked when Ray finally emerged from the basement. Ray lit a cigarette, ignoring the no-smoking signs Celeste had posted everywhere. "It's worse than you thought." "How much worse?" The foundation's compromised in 3 places. The main beam you flagged is shot. And the roof! Jesus, Nolan, I don't even know how that roof is still up there. One good windstorm and this whole thing's coming down. Nolan felt his stomach drop. Can we fix it? Fix it? Sure. If you've got 6 months and a blank check. We got 60 days and whatever Celeste can scrape together. Ray laughed, a short, humorless sound. Then you're screwed. Ray, I'm serious. You want my advice? Walk away. This building's not worth dying over. Nolan watched Ray climb into his truck and drive off, the taillights disappearing into the dusk. Then he turned and found Celeste standing in the doorway of the ironworks, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold something in. You heard all that? Nolan said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. And? She looked at him, her eyes hard. I'm not walking away. Celeste. I don't care what he said. I'm not giving up. Nolan wanted to argue, wanted to tell her Ray was right, that this was a fight she couldn't win. But the words died in his throat because he could see it in her face. The same stubborn refusal to quit that he'd seen in the mirror every morning for the past 2 years. All right, he said. Then we do this the hard way. The hard way meant working faster than was safe and smarter than they had any right to be. Nolan called in favors from every contractor and supplier he knew, begging for materials at cost and labor at rates that barely covered gas money. Celeste liquidated what assets she could access, selling off jewelry and art and pieces of furniture that had been in her family for generations. It still wasn't enough, but it was something. They started with the foundation, jacking up the building section by section and pouring new concrete to reinforce the weak points. It was backbreaking work that required precision and patience, 2 things they didn't have much of. Nolan worked through the nights, catching sleep in 2-hour bursts on a cot he'd set up in the corner of the main floor. Celeste was there with him most of the time, learning to mix concrete and run equipment and read the kind of technical drawings that would have made most people's eyes glaze over. You're getting good at this, Nolan said one night, watching her adjust the hydraulic jack with the kind of focus he usually only saw in trained engineers. Don't sound so surprised. I'm not. I'm impressed. She glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You know, when I first met you, I thought you were going to be one of those guys who talks down to me the whole time, explains things I already understand, treats me like I'm decoration. I don't do that. No, you don't. She tightened a bolt, testing the tension. Why not? Because I've been underestimated my whole life. I know what it feels like. Celeste set down her wrench and looked at him, really looked at him, and Nolan felt something pass between them that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't attraction, or at least it wasn't just attraction. It was recognition, the sense that they were both fighting the same fight, just in different arenas. Tell me about Tyler, she said suddenly. Nolan blinked. What? Your son. You never talk about him. There's not much to tell. I don't believe that. Nolan hesitated, then pulled out his phone and showed her the photo Tyler had sent, the stick figures standing side by side. Celeste studied it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. He's lucky to have you, she said finally. I'm the lucky one. Does he know? What you're doing here? He knows I'm helping someone. He doesn't know the details. You should bring him by sometime. Let him see what you're building. Nolan thought about that. About Tyler standing in this gutted, half-ruined space and trying to imagine what it could become. Maybe, he said, when it's safer. 3 weeks in, they hit their first real crisis. The city inspector showed up unannounced, a thin man in his 50s with a clipboard and an expression that suggested he'd already made up his mind. Nolan met him at the door, still covered in concrete dust, and tried to project a confidence he didn't feel. Mr. Pierce, so, the inspector said, not offering his hand. I'm here to check your progress. We're ahead of schedule. We'll see. The inspector spent an hour walking through the building, taking notes and asking questions Nolan answered as carefully as he could. When he finally finished, he turned to Nolan with a look that was equal parts pity and annoyance. You've done good work here, he said, but it's not enough. Nolan's chest tightened. What do you mean? I mean the structural damage is more extensive than the original report indicated. You've addressed the foundation, but the load-bearing walls on the second floor are compromised, and the roof needs to be completely replaced. We're working on it. Not fast enough. I'm extending the deadline by 30 days, but if you can't show significant progress by then, I'm recommending demolition." The inspector left and Nolan stood in the empty doorway, staring at nothing. 30 days. It wasn't enough time. Not even close. Celeste found him there an hour later, still standing in the same spot. "Nolan?" He didn't answer. "Hey." She touched his arm gently. "Talk to me." "We can't do this," he said quietly. "Ray was right. We should have walked away." "We're not walking away." "Celeste, we don't have time. Even if we work 24 hours a day, we can't replace the roof and fix the walls and pass inspection in 30 days. It's not possible." "Then we'll make it possible." "How?" She didn't have an answer, and Nolan felt the weight of the building pressing down on him like something physical. He'd made a promise. He'd told her they could save this place, and now he was going to fail, just like he'd failed at everything else that mattered. But Celeste wasn't giving up. Over the next week, she called in every favor she had, reaching out to people Nolan had never heard of, architects and engineers and construction managers who owed her father something or respected his legacy enough to help. Slowly, a crew started to form. Not a big one, and not professional, but enough bodies to make a difference. They worked in shifts, some during the day, some at night, all of them driven by a mix of loyalty and desperation that Nolan recognized because he felt it too. The roof went up piece by piece, new steel trusses replacing the rotted wood that had been there for decades. The walls were reinforced with steel plates and fresh concrete, shored up until they could bear the weight they were supposed to carry. And through it all, Nolan and Celeste worked side by side, their conversations growing easier, their silences more comfortable. She learned to read his moods, to know when he needed space and when he needed someone to push him forward. He learned to see past the polished exterior she showed the world, to the woman underneath who was just as scared and uncertain as he was. "Why don't you ever talk about your father?" Nolan asked one night as they were packing up tools. Celeste paused, her hands stilling. "Because it hurts." "That's not a good reason to avoid it." "Says the guy who never talks about his ex-wife." Nolan winced. "Touché." She sat down on a stack of lumber, pulling her knees up to her chest. "My father was brilliant. Everyone said so. He could look at a piece of metal and see what it could become. He built this place when no one thought he could, and he turned it into something that mattered." She paused, her voice dropping. "And then he got sick. Cancer. It took him in 6 months, and by the end, he couldn't even remember my name." "I'm sorry." "Yeah, me too." She looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I keep thinking if I save this place, it'll mean something, like I'll prove I was worth his faith, but some days I'm not sure it's enough." "It's enough," Nolan said quietly. "Trust me." She wiped her eyes and stood, forcing a smile. "Come on, we've still got work to do." The 4th week brought a new problem, one Nolan should have seen coming. A man in an expensive suit showed up at the site just after dawn, flanked by 2 lawyers and a photographer. Nolan recognized the type immediately, money and arrogance wrapped in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Marcus Hale," the man said, extending his hand. "I believe we have some business to discuss." Nolan didn't take the hand. "We're not selling. I wasn't talking to you." Hale turned to Celeste, who'd emerged from inside the building, her expression carefully neutral. "Miss Arden, it's been a while." "Not long enough." Hale laughed, a smooth, practiced sound. "Still stubborn, I see. Your father had the same problem." "My father knew a vulture when he saw one." "Is that what you think I am?" Hale gestured to the building behind them. "I'm offering you a way out, a generous way out. You take my offer, and you walk away with enough money to start fresh. Build something new, something that isn't falling apart." "I'm not interested." "You should be, because this place is never going to pass inspection. You're wasting your time and your money on a lost cause." Celeste stepped forward, her voice cold. "Get off my property." Hale's smile faded. "You're making a mistake." "That's my problem, not yours." Hale looked at Nolan, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked back to his car, the lawyers and photographer trailing behind him. Nolan watched them go, his jaw tight. "He's going to be a problem," he said. "I know." "How bad?" Celeste didn't answer right away. Then she said, He's been trying to buy this place for 3 years. He's got connections at City Hall, friends on the zoning board. If he wants to make our lives difficult, he can. Then we'll deal with it. Nolan, we'll deal with it, he said again, more firmly this time. We've come this far. We're not stopping now. But stopping was exactly what Marcus Hale had in mind. Over the next few days, permits that should have been approved got delayed. Inspections that should have been routine turned into interrogations. Suppliers who'd agreed to work at cost suddenly raised their prices or claimed they were out of stock. It was sabotage, plain and simple, and Nolan felt his anger building with every new obstacle. "He's trying to bleed us dry," Celeste said one night, staring at a stack of invoices that had doubled overnight. "And it's working. Then we find another way." "There is no other way. We're out of money, Nolan. I've sold everything I can access. The rest is tied up in trusts I can't touch for another 2 years. Nolan looked at the invoices, then at Celeste, and made a decision he knew he'd regret. "I've got savings. Not much, but enough to cover materials for another week." "No, absolutely not." "Celeste, that's your son's future. I'm not taking it. You're not taking it. I'm giving it." She stared at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and horror. "Why would you do that?" "Because this matters. You matter." The words hung in the air between them, and Nolan realized too late what he'd just admitted. But Celeste didn't look away. She held his gaze, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to figure out if he meant it. "Okay," she said finally, "but I'm paying you back. Every cent." "Sure." "I mean it." "I know." They went back to work, but something had shifted between them, something Nolan couldn't name but felt all the same. It was there in the way Celeste smiled at him when she thought he wasn't looking, in the way his hand lingered on hers when they passed tools back and forth, in the silences that stretched between them, comfortable and charged at the same time. He told himself it didn't mean anything, that he was too tired and too broke to be thinking about things like this. But late at night, when the building was quiet and Celeste was asleep on the cot across from his, Nolan would lie awake and wonder what the hell he was doing, whether he was fixing a building or building something else entirely. And he didn't have an answer. By the end of the 5th week, the ironworks was starting to look like something salvageable. The foundation was solid. The walls were reinforced. The roof was watertight. It wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but it was standing, and that was more than Nolan had dared to hope for a month ago. The final inspection was scheduled for the following Monday, 5 days away. Nolan spent every waking hour making sure everything was perfect, checking and rechecking every weld, every bolt, every inch of concrete. Celeste worked alongside him, her confidence growing with every task she completed. "We're going to make it," she said on Sunday night, standing in the middle of the main floor and looking up at the new steel beams overhead. "We're actually going to make it." Nolan wanted to believe her, but he'd learned a long time ago that hope was dangerous, and he wasn't ready to let his guard down yet. "Maybe," he said. "Let's see what the inspector says first." Celeste turned to face him, her expression serious. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know this wouldn't have been possible without you. You did the work. We did the work. Together." Nolan met her eyes, and for a moment the exhaustion and the fear and the weight of everything they'd been carrying fell away. It was just the two of them, standing in a building they'd saved against impossible odds. And Nolan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. "Yeah," he said softly. Together. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of weather that made everything feel heavier than it was. Nolan got to the ironworks an hour before the inspector was scheduled to arrive, walking through every floor one last time, his flashlight cutting through the dim interior. Everything looked solid. The beams were in place, the welds clean, the concrete cured and level. It should have been enough. Should have been. Celeste was already there when he came back down, pacing near the entrance with her phone pressed to her ear. She was arguing with someone, her voice tight with frustration, and when she saw Nolan, she ended the call abruptly. "Problem?" he asked. "The inspector's running late. His office says he'll be here by noon." "That's not unusual. It is when Marcus Hale's lawyer called me 20 minutes ago offering double his previous bid." She shoved her phone into her pocket, her hands shaking slightly. "He knows something. I can feel it." Nolan wanted to tell her she was being paranoid, but he couldn't. He'd seen the way Hale operated, the delays, the inflated invoices, the sudden permit issues that appeared out of nowhere. The man didn't make moves unless he had leverage, and the timing of this offer wasn't a coincidence. "Let's just get through the inspection," Nolan said. "Whatever Hale's planning, we deal with it after." Celeste nodded, but she didn't stop pacing. The inspector showed up just after noon, the same thin man from before, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him was a younger guy in a city vest carrying what looked like a portable X-ray scanner, and behind him was someone Nolan recognized immediately, a zoning official named Brennan, who had a reputation for being bought and paid for by whoever had the deepest pockets. "Mr. Pierce, the inspector said, his voice flat. "Miss Arden, we're here to conduct the final structural assessment." "We're ready," Celeste said. Brennan stepped forward, a thin smile on his face. "Actually, there's been a development. We received new information this morning regarding potential code violations that weren't flagged in the original inspection." Nolan's stomach dropped. "What kind of violations?" "Load distribution irregularities, unapproved modifications to the original framework, possible non-compliance with seismic standards." Brennan pulled out a tablet, scrolling through what looked like a freshly generated report. "We'll need to verify everything before we can issue a certificate of occupancy." "That wasn't part of the inspection criteria," Celeste said, her voice rising. "We followed the original report to the letter. The criteria have been updated to reflect current city standards." "Since when?" "Since this morning." Nolan felt the anger building in his chest, hot and sharp. "This is bullshit, and you know it." Brennan's smile didn't waver. "I'd be careful about making accusations, Mr. Pierce. We're just doing our job." The inspection took 4 hours. They went over every inch of the building, using equipment Nolan had never seen in a routine assessment, taking measurements and photographs and samples of materials that had already been approved weeks ago. The inspector asked questions Nolan answered mechanically, his mind racing through the implications of what was happening. This wasn't an inspection. It was a hit job. When they finally finished, the inspector gathered his notes and turned to Celeste with an expression that might have been sympathy if Nolan thought the man was capable of it. "I'll have the full report by Friday," he said. "But preliminarily, I'm seeing several areas of concern that will need to be addressed before we can approve the building for use." "What areas?" Celeste demanded. "The second floor load distribution, the western wall reinforcement, and the roof attachment points." Nolan stepped forward. "We reinforced all of those. You saw the work yourself 3 weeks ago. New standards require additional verification." "This is insane." "This is city code, Mr. Pierce. If you have a problem with it, you can file an appeal." "How long does an appeal take?" The inspector didn't answer, but Brennan did. 6 to 8 weeks, assuming it's approved." Celeste's face went white. "We don't have 6 weeks." "Then I suggest you consider your options." Brennan tucked his tablet under his arm, nodding to the inspector. "We'll be in touch." They left, their footsteps echoing in the empty building, and Nolan stood there feeling like the floor had just dropped out from under him. 6 weeks. They'd already burned through every extension the city had given them. Another 6 weeks meant automatic demolition. "They can't do this," Celeste said, her voice shaking. This is corrupt. This is Hale paying them off to bury us." "Probably." "So what do we do?" Nolan didn't have an answer. He walked to the nearest wall and leaned against it, pressing his palms flat against the concrete they'd poured with their own hands. All that work, all those sleepless nights and bruised knuckles and moments when he thought they might actually pull this off. And now it was slipping away because some developer with deep pockets wanted the land more than they wanted justice. "Nolan?" He looked at Celeste and saw something he'd never seen in her before. Defeat. Real, bone-deep defeat. The kind that made you stop fighting because you'd finally run out of reasons to keep going. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I really don't know." That night, Nolan went home for the first time in 3 days. His apartment felt foreign, like a place he used to live but didn't anymore. Tyler was asleep in his room, curled up under a blanket covered in cartoon dinosaurs, and Nolan stood in the doorway for a long time, just watching him breathe. His mother was in the kitchen, washing dishes with the kind of efficiency that came from years of raising kids on her own. "You look like hell," she said, without turning around. "Thanks, Ma. I'm serious." When's the last time you ate something that wasn't cold pizza? Nolan couldn't remember. I've been busy. Too busy to take care of yourself? She dried her hands and turned to face him, her expression somewhere between concern and annoyance. Tyler's been asking about you. Wants to know when you're coming home for real. I know. I'm sorry. Don't apologize to me. Apologize to him. She paused, studying his face. This building you're working on, is it worth it? Nolan thought about Celeste standing in the ironworks, her hands covered in concrete dust, her eyes bright with determination. He thought about the way she'd fought for something that mattered, the way she'd refused to give up even when everyone told her she should. And he thought about the way he'd felt working beside her, like he was building something that lasted, something bigger than just survival. Yeah, he said. It is, his mother sighed. Then finish it, but don't forget you've got people here who need you too. Nolan nodded, kissed her on the cheek, and went to bed. But sleep didn't come. He lay there staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios in his head, trying to find a way forward that didn't end with Celeste losing everything. By morning, he still didn't have an answer. He met Celeste at a coffee shop downtown, a neutral space away from the ironworks and the weight of what they were facing. She looked worse than he'd ever seen her, dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. I talked to my lawyer, she said. He says we can fight the new inspection criteria, but it'll take months, maybe longer. We don't have months. I know. She finally took a sip of coffee, wincing like it burned. Hale called me again this morning, raised his offer, said it's my last chance to walk away clean. Nolan felt something cold settle in his chest. Are you considering it? I don't know. Maybe I should be. She set the cup down, her hands trembling. I've spent everything, Nolan. My inheritance, my savings, pieces of my father's legacy that I swore I'd never sell. And for what? So I can drag this out another few weeks before the city tears it down anyway? That's not going to happen. How do you know? Because we've come too far to quit now. Celeste looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed. What if quitting is the smart thing to do? Then we're not smart. We're stubborn. Nolan reached across the table, covering her hand with his. Listen to me. Hale wants you to fold. That's why he's pushing so hard, why he's throwing money at city officials and changing the rules mid-game. He knows if we get that certificate, he loses. So we don't give him the satisfaction. How? The inspection's going to fail. You know it is. Maybe, but we've got until Friday before the official report comes in. That's 4 days. 4 days to find something they missed, some angle they didn't cover. Like what? Nolan didn't know yet, but he wasn't about to admit that. Let me work on it. Just don't make any decisions until Friday. Can you do that? Celeste hesitated, then nodded slowly. 4 days? 4 days. Nolan spent the next 2 days buried in code books and city ordinances, looking for loopholes or precedents that might give them leverage. He called Ray, who was no help. He reached out to other engineers, most of whom told him the same thing. If the city wanted the building gone, the building was gone. But on Wednesday afternoon, he found something. It was buried in an old zoning amendment from the 1970s, a clause about buildings with historical significance being exempt from certain seismic requirements if they met alternative safety standards. The ironworks wasn't officially listed as a historic landmark, but it had been built in 1923, which put it in the right era, and Nolan was willing to bet most people at City Hall had no idea the clause existed. He called Celeste immediately. I found something. What? A loophole. It's a long shot, but if we can get the building recognized as historically significant, we can bypass half the new requirements they're hitting us with. How do we do that? We file a petition with the Historical Preservation Committee. If they approve it, the city has to honor the exemption. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Celeste said, How long does that take? Normally, 6 months. But there's an emergency provision for buildings under imminent threat of demolition. We could get a hearing as early as next week. Next week's too late. The report comes out Friday. Then we stall. We file the petition tomorrow, send copies to the inspector and the zoning office, and argue that they can't finalize the report while the historical review is pending. Will that work? I have no idea, but it's better than nothing. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Do it. They filed the petition Thursday morning, hand-delivering copies to every relevant office and making sure the paperwork was airtight. The response was immediate. By noon, Nolan's phone was ringing, first the inspector, then Brennan, then someone from the city attorney's office, all of them demanding to know what he thought he was doing. Following the law, Nolan said calmly. If you have a problem with that, take it up with the Historical Preservation Committee. Brennan called Celeste directly, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. This is a stalling tactic and everyone knows it. Then it should be easy to dismiss, Celeste said sweetly. Unless you're worried the committee might actually agree with us. That building is not historically significant. That's not your call to make. Brennan hung up and Celeste sat down hard, her hands shaking. I can't believe that worked. It hasn't worked yet, Nolan said. We still need the hearing, and we need evidence that the building matters. What kind of evidence? Photographs, architectural surveys, documentation of its role in the city's industrial history. Nolan pulled out his laptop, already pulling up archives. Your father kept records, right? Plans, contracts, anything that shows what this place used to be? Everything's in storage. I can get access, but it'll take time. We don't have time. We need it by tomorrow. Celeste grabbed her coat. Then let's go. They spent the rest of the day in a climate-controlled storage unit on the outskirts of the city, digging through boxes of her father's papers. Most of it was financial records and legal documents, useless for their purposes. But buried in the back they found what they needed. Blueprints from the original construction, photographs of the ironworks in its heyday, letters from city officials praising its design and contribution to the local economy. This is it, Nolan said, spreading the photographs across the concrete floor. This proves the building was a landmark in its time. Celeste picked up one of the photos, a black and white image of her father standing in front of the ironworks on opening day, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his expression proud. He would have hated this, she said softly, using his work to beg for permission to keep it standing. He would have understood. Would he? She set the photo down, her voice cracking. I keep thinking I'm honoring his legacy, but maybe I'm just being selfish. Maybe the smart thing is to let it go. Nolan moved closer, crouching beside her. You're not being selfish. You're fighting for something that matters. That's not the same thing. How do you know? Because I'm fighting too. And I'm not doing it for me. Celeste looked at him, her eyes searching his face, and Nolan realized how close they were, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, close enough that if he leaned forward just a few inches, their faces would touch. The air between them felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks, and Nolan's pulse kicked up in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Nolan, she said quietly. Yeah? Thank you. For everything. He wanted to tell her she didn't need to thank him, that he'd have done this anyway because walking away from her wasn't something he was capable of anymore. But the words stuck in his throat, so he just nodded and stood, putting distance between them before he did something stupid. They compiled the evidence into a presentation that night, working side by side in Celeste's apartment. A sleek, modern space that felt nothing like the ironworks but somehow fit her perfectly. Nolan had never been here before, and he found himself noticing details he wouldn't have otherwise. The way she kept her space obsessively organized, the framed photo of her father on the mantel, the stack of architecture books on the coffee table, their spines creased from use. You read a lot, he said, nodding at the books. When I can't sleep, which is most nights. Celeste handed him a cup of coffee, sitting down beside him on the couch. My father used to say buildings tell stories, that if you know how to read them, you can see the lives that pass through them. He was right. Yeah, he usually was. She paused, staring at the presentation on her laptop screen. Do you think this'll work? The hearing? I think we've got a shot. But you're not sure. No, I'm not sure. Celeste closed the laptop, turning to face him. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why didn't you walk away? That first night, when you realized I'd mistaken you for someone else. You could have left. Should have left, probably. But you didn't. Why? Nolan thought about that, about the moment he'd seen the flaw in the blueprints, the way something in him had shifted when he realized this wasn't just another job. It was a fight worth having. I don't know, he said honestly. Maybe I was tired of walking away from things. Or maybe I just saw someone who needed help and couldn't ignore it. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. Celeste held his gaze for a long moment, then reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, her grip firm, and Nolan felt something in his chest loosen, something he'd been holding tight for so long he'd forgotten it was there. I'm glad you stayed, she said softly. Me too. They sat there in the quiet, the presentation forgotten, the city humming outside the windows. And for the first time in weeks, Nolan let himself believe they might actually pull this off. Friday morning came too fast. The hearing was scheduled for 10, which gave them just enough time to get to City Hall and set up. The Historical Preservation Committee met in a small room on the third floor, a space that felt more like a classroom than a government office, with folding chairs and a long table where the committee members sat looking vaguely bored. There were 5 of them, 3 men and 2 women, all in their 50s or 60s, all wearing the kind of neutral expressions that gave nothing away. Nolan recognized one of them, a former city planner named Ortiz, who had a reputation for being fair but tough. That was something, at least. Celeste presented first, walking the committee through the history of the ironworks with the kind of confidence Nolan had seen in her from the beginning. She showed them the photographs, the blueprints, the letters from city officials. She talked about her father's vision, about the role the building had played in the city's industrial growth, about what it would mean to lose it now. She was good, better than good. She made the case like she'd been doing this her whole life, and when she finished, even the bored-looking committee members seemed engaged. Then it was Nolan's turn. He walked them through the structural work they'd done, explaining how they'd preserved the original framework while meeting modern safety standards. He showed them the engineering reports, the inspection records, the evidence that the building was sound, and then he made the argument he'd been building toward all week. This building isn't just history, he said. It's proof that we can honor the past while building for the future. Tearing it down doesn't make us safer or smarter. It just makes us poorer. When he finished, Ortiz leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Mr. Pierce, you're aware that granting historical designation doesn't guarantee the building will be saved. I am. And you understand that even with the exemption, you'll still need to meet baseline safety requirements? Yes. Then let me ask you this. Why should we care? There are dozens of buildings in this city with similar histories. What makes this one special? Nolan glanced at Celeste, then back at Ortiz. Because someone's willing to fight for it, and that should mean something. The committee deliberated for 20 minutes, during which Nolan and Celeste sat in the hallway outside, not talking, just waiting. When the door finally opened, Ortiz stepped out, his expression giving nothing away. We've reviewed your petition, he said, and we've decided to grant provisional historical designation pending a full architectural survey. Celeste's face lit up. Really? Really? The survey will take 2 weeks, but in the meantime, the city is required to halt any demolition proceedings. He paused, his expression softening slightly. You've done good work here, Ms. Arden. Don't waste it. They left City Hall in a daze, stepping out into the cool November air. Celeste turned to Nolan, her eyes bright with something that looked like hope. We did it, she said. We bought time. That's not the same thing. It's close enough. She grabbed his hand, squeezing it tight. We're going to win this. I can feel it. Nolan wanted to believe her, but he'd been around long enough to know that winning wasn't guaranteed, and hope was a dangerous thing to hold on to. Still, when Celeste smiled at him like that, it was hard not to feel it too. The hope lasted exactly 3 days. On Monday afternoon, Nolan was at the ironworks finishing the installation of new fire suppression equipment when his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but he answered anyway, wedging the phone between his shoulder and ear while he tightened a valve connection. Mr. Pierce? The voice was professional, clipped. This is Janet Coe from the city attorney's office. I'm calling to inform you that Marcus Hale has filed a formal objection to the historical designation of the property at 1847 Industrial Way. Nolan straightened, the wrench slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. On what grounds? Mr. Hale claims the building poses an immediate public safety risk, and that historical designation shouldn't prevent the city from protecting its citizens. There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. He's also submitted documentation of what he calls structural deficiencies that weren't addressed in your petition. That's garbage. We fixed everything. That may be, but the committee is required to review all objections before finalizing any designation. The hearing's been pushed back 2 weeks. 2 weeks? We don't have 2 weeks. I'm sorry, Mr. Pierce. It's out of my hands. The line went dead. Nolan stood there holding the phone, feeling the walls close in around him. 2 more weeks of uncertainty. 2 more weeks for Hale to dig up problems that didn't exist and pay off officials who should have known better. 2 more weeks of watching Celeste pour everything she had into something that might still get ripped away. He called her immediately. She picked up on the first ring. Hale filed an objection, he said without preamble. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Nolan thought the call had dropped. Then Celeste said very quietly, "Of course he did. We can fight it." "With what?" "We're out of money, Nolan. Out of time. Out of everything except stubbornness." Her voice cracked. "Maybe that's not enough." "Don't say that." "Why not? It's true." Nolan wanted to argue, wanted to tell her they'd find a way, but the words felt hollow even as he thought them. Instead, he said, "Where are you?" "Home." "Why?" "Stay there. I'm coming over." He found her sitting on her apartment balcony, wrapped in a blanket despite the cold, staring out at the city skyline. She didn't turn when he stepped outside, didn't acknowledge him until he sat down in the chair beside her. "I talked to my lawyer," she said. "He says Hale's objection is thin, but it doesn't matter. The committee has to review it, and that means everything's on hold until they do." So we wait. Mike, and then what? Even if we get the designation, we still need the architectural survey. We still need permits. We still need to prove to the city that the building's safe. She pulled the blanket tighter. Hale's not going to stop. Every time we get close, he'll find another way to drag this out until I'm so buried in debt, I have no choice but to sell. You've got a choice. You've always got a choice. Celeste finally looked at him, and Nolan saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Exhaustion so deep it looked like surrender. Do I? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like I'm just postponing the inevitable. That's fear talking. No, that's reality. She stood abruptly, the blanket falling to the ground. I'm not like you, Nolan. I can't just keep going on faith and stubbornness. I need to know there's an endpoint, that this nightmare has a finish line. And right now I don't see one. Nolan stood too, closing the distance between them. Then stop looking for it. Stop thinking about the endpoint and just focus on tomorrow, on the next step. What's the next step? We get through the objection hearing. We prove Hale's full of it. We keep the building standing. And if we can't, then we try something else. He reached out, taking her hands in his. They were cold, trembling slightly. Listen to me. I've spent the last 2 years of my life in survival mode, just trying to make it through each day without everything falling apart. And it worked. I survived. But surviving isn't living, and I'm tired of pretending it's enough. He squeezed her hands gently. This building, working on it with you. It's the first time in a long time I've felt like I'm building something instead of just holding the pieces together. So no, I'm not giving up. And neither are you. Celeste stared at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Why do you care so much? The question hung between them, and Nolan realized he didn't have a good answer. Or maybe he had one and just wasn't ready to say it out loud. Because the truth was complicated and messy and involved feelings he hadn't let himself have in years. Because you matter, he said finally, and because this matters. That's enough for me. Celeste pulled her hands free, wrapping her arms around herself. I don't know if it's enough for me. Then figure it out. But don't make any decisions tonight. Sleep on it. See how you feel in the morning. She nodded, but she wouldn't meet his eyes, and when Nolan left an hour later, he wasn't sure she'd still be in the fight come sunrise. He got his answer the next morning when she showed up at the ironworks at 6, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a folder thick with documents. What's this? Nolan asked, taking the coffee. Hale's objection. I got a copy from the city attorney's office. She set the folder down on a makeshift workbench, flipping it open. He's claiming the building's foundation is unstable and that we falsified inspection reports to hide it. That's insane. Ray signed off on everything. I know, but Hale's got his own engineer who says otherwise. She pulled out a report, sliding it across to Nolan. According to this, the northwest corner is sinking and the whole structure's at risk of collapse. Nolan scanned the report, his jaw tightening. The claims were specific enough to sound credible, but vague enough to be hard to disprove without another full inspection. And the engineer who'd signed it was someone Nolan had never heard of, probably someone Hale kept on retainer for exactly this kind of thing. "This is a lie," Nolan said flatly. "Can you prove it?" "Yeah, I can take the committee out here and show them the foundation myself. It's solid. And if they don't believe you?" Nolan didn't answer because he didn't have one. Instead, he pulled out his phone and called Ray, who answered on the third ring, sounding like he'd just woken up. "This better be good, Pierce. Hale hired an engineer to claim our foundation's failing. I need you to come out here and document everything so we've got evidence for the hearing." Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know I'm retired, right?" "I know." "And you know I told you to walk away from this mess weeks ago?" "I know that too. And you're still asking me to drive across town to help you fight a billionaire who's probably got half the city in his pocket?" "Yeah," Ray sighed. "I'll be there in an hour." He showed up 90 minutes later with a van full of testing equipment and an expression that suggested he regretted every decision that had led him to this moment. But he worked without complaint, spending the entire day running tests and taking measurements while Nolan and Celeste assisted. By evening, he had enough data to fill a 3-inch binder. "The foundation's fine," Ray said, packing up his equipment. "Better than fine, actually. Whoever wrote that report for Hale either didn't actually inspect the building or deliberately lied." "Can you testify to that?" Celeste asked. "At the hearing? Sure. But you need to understand something. Hale's not going to back down just because I show up with numbers. He's got resources and connections you don't. This is going to get ugly." "It's already ugly," Nolan said. "Then it's going to get uglier." Ray handed the binder to Celeste. "Good luck. You're going to need it." The objection hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday, which gave them 5 days to prepare. Celeste spent every waking hour on the phone with lawyers and city officials, building their case. Nolan focused on the ironworks, making sure every detail was perfect so there'd be no legitimate complaints when the committee came to inspect. But on Wednesday night, everything changed. Nolan was alone in the building, working late to finish the electrical upgrades, when he heard a sound that didn't belong. A metallic groan, deep and resonant, coming from somewhere overhead. He looked up just in time to see the freight elevator, an ancient contraption they'd reinforced but hadn't fully replaced yet, lurch sideways in its shaft. Then it fell. The crash was deafening, a sound like the world ending. The elevator car plummeted 4 stories and slammed into the basement floor, taking out a support column on its way down. The impact sent a shockwave through the building, knocking Nolan off his feet. He hit the ground hard, the breath driven from his lungs. And for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think, could only lie there as dust and debris rained down around him. When he finally managed to stand, his ears ringing and his vision swimming, he saw the damage. The support column was gone, sheared clean through by the falling elevator. And without that column, the second floor was sagging, the beams groaning under weight they weren't designed to carry alone. Nolan pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called Celeste. "The elevator collapsed," he said when she answered. "It took out a column. The building's not stable." There was a beat of silence. Then Celeste said, "How bad?" "Bad. The second floor could come down. We need to evacuate and get structural support in here immediately." "I'm on my way." She arrived 20 minutes later with an emergency crew and a structural engineer Nolan didn't recognize. They worked through the night, installing temporary supports to keep the second floor from collapsing while they assessed the damage. By dawn, the verdict was clear. "The column's destroyed," the engineer said. "You'll need to replace it completely, and that's assuming the damage didn't compromise the surrounding structure." "How long?" Celeste asked, her voice hollow. 3 weeks, maybe 4. "We don't have 4 weeks. Then you've got a problem." The engineer left, and Nolan and Celeste stood in the wreckage surrounded by the twisted metal of the elevator car and the rubble from the destroyed column. Everything they'd built was falling apart, literally and figuratively, and Nolan couldn't see a way forward. "It was sabotage," Celeste said suddenly. Nolan looked at her. "What?" "The elevator. Someone cut the cables." She pointed to the shaft, where the severed ends of the support cables dangled like broken limbs. "Look at them. Those aren't frayed. They're cut." Nolan moved closer, pulling out his flashlight. She was right. The The cables had been sliced through with something sharp, probably industrial cutters. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Hale, he said quietly. It has to be. Who else would benefit from this? We need to call the police. And tell them what? That we think a billionaire developer sabotaged our building, but we have no proof? Celeste laughed bitterly. They'll write it up as an accident and move on. So what do we do? Celeste was quiet for a long time, staring at the ruined column. Then she said, We fix it anyway. Celeste, I mean it. Hale wants us to give up. That's why he did this. He's counting on us to look at this mess and decide it's not worth fighting for. She turned to face Nolan, and there was something fierce in her eyes, something that reminded him of why he'd stayed in the first place. But I'm not giving him the satisfaction. We fix the column, we stabilize the building, and we show up at that hearing with proof that we're not backing down. It'll cost everything we have left. I know, and we might still lose. I know that too. She stepped closer, her voice dropping. But I'd rather lose fighting than win by surrender. Wouldn't you? Nolan thought about Tyler, about the savings account he'd already emptied to keep this project alive. He thought about his mother's warnings and Ray's advice, and every rational reason he had to walk away. And then he thought about the way Celeste looked standing in the ruins of her father's legacy, refusing to let it die. Yeah, he said, I would. They worked through the rest of the week in a haze of exhaustion and desperation, calling in every favor they had left. Nolan assembled a crew from people he'd worked with over the years, contractors and welders and engineers who owed him something or respected him enough to help. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, fabricating a replacement column and installing it with a precision that left no room for error. Celeste was there for all of it, working alongside them, her hands blistered and her face streaked with grime. She learned to weld, to read load calculations, to spot problems before they became disasters. She became part of the crew in a way that surprised everyone, including herself. You're good at this, Nolan said on the third night, watching her adjust a hydraulic jack with the kind of confidence most people took years to develop. I had a good teacher. I didn't teach you that. You taught me not to quit. The rest I figured out. On Thursday morning, 6 hours before the hearing, they finished. The new column was in place, the structure stabilized, the building standing. It wasn't pretty and it wasn't perfect, but it was done. Nolan stood in the center of the main floor, looking up at the work they'd accomplished, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not hope, exactly. Something quieter. Something that felt like peace. We did it, Celeste said, appearing at his side. We did. Think it'll be enough? I don't know, but we gave it everything. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. No matter what happens today, I want you to know I couldn't have done this without you. Nolan looked at her, at the woman who'd gone from a stranger in a bar to someone he couldn't imagine his life without, and realized he was in trouble. The kind of trouble that didn't have an easy solution, that involved feelings he'd sworn off after his divorce. But standing there in the ironworks they'd saved together, he couldn't bring himself to care. Yeah, he said softly. Me neither. The hearing started at 2. The committee room was packed. City officials, reporters, activists who'd caught wind of the fight and showed up to support or oppose. Marcus Hale was there too, sitting in the front row with his lawyers, his expression calm and confident. Celeste presented first, walking the committee through everything they'd done since the last hearing. She showed them Ray's documentation, the photos of the foundation, the engineering reports that proved the building was sound. And then she showed them the evidence of sabotage, the cut cables, the destroyed column, the deliberate attempt to make the building fail. Someone wants this building gone, she said, her voice steady, and they're willing to break the law to make it happen. But we're still standing. We fixed the damage. We met every standard you asked for, and then some. And we're asking you to recognize that this building is worth saving. Hale's lawyer stood next, smooth and practiced. The committee should note that Ms. Arden has provided no evidence linking my client to the alleged sabotage. These are serious accusations being made without proof. The cables were cut, Celeste shot back. That's not an accident. It's also not proof of anything except that Ms. Arden has failed to properly secure her construction site. The back and forth went on for an hour. Arguments and counter-arguments that seemed designed to obscure the truth rather than reveal it. Nolan watched it all from the back of the room, his hands clenched into fists, feeling helpless. Finally, Ortiz called for order. "We've heard enough. The committee will deliberate and issue a decision within 48 hours. 48 hours? Celeste stood. "With respect, we can't wait that long. The city's demolition order is still active. We need a decision now." "I understand your urgency, Ms. Arden, but we have a process." "Your process is going to get my building torn down." Ortiz's expression softened slightly. "Then I suggest you find a way to delay the demolition order, because the committee doesn't work on anyone's timeline but our own." The hearing ended and Celeste walked out looking like someone had punched her. Nolan caught up to her in the hallway, but before he could say anything, she turned to him with eyes that were more angry than defeated. "I'm not waiting 48 hours. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to City Hall. I'm going to camp out in the mayor's office if I have to. I'm going to make enough noise that they can't ignore me." "Celeste, don't try to stop me." "I'm not. I'm coming with you." They spent the rest of the afternoon and all of the next day doing exactly that, making noise. They called reporters, staged a protest outside City Hall, got activists and community members to flood the mayor's office with calls and emails. It was exhausting and probably futile, but it was something, and something was better than nothing. On Friday evening, Nolan's phone rang. It was Ortiz. "The committee's reached a decision," he said. "We're granting full historical designation." Nolan felt his knees go weak. "You're serious?" "We are. The architectural survey confirmed the building's significance, and we found your evidence of sabotage compelling enough to warrant further investigation." He paused. "You should know, this doesn't guarantee the building's safety. You'll still need to pass final inspection, but it buys you time." "How much time?" 90 days. After that, if you can't get the permits, the city moves forward with demolition." Nolan thanked him and ended the call, then turned to Celeste, who was watching him with an expression caught between hope and fear. "We got it," he said. "Historical designation, 90 days. For a moment, Celeste just stared at him. Then she started laughing, a sound that was half relief, half hysteria. Nolan found himself laughing too, and before he knew what was happening, she was in his arms, holding him tight enough that he could feel her heart racing against his chest. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it. We're not done yet." "I know, but we're still in the fight." She pulled back just enough to look at him, and Nolan saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. "Thank you for everything." He wanted to tell her she didn't need to thank him, that he'd do it again in a heartbeat, that somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about the building and started being about her. But before he could say any of that, his phone rang again. It was his mother. "Nolan, you need to get to the hospital. It's Tyler." The world narrowed to the sound of Nolan's boots hitting pavement as he ran through the hospital parking lot, Celeste right behind him. His mother had said Tyler fell at school, hit his head, wouldn't wake up for a few minutes. The words kept looping in Nolan's mind, each repetition tightening the knot in his chest. He burst through the emergency room doors and found his mother in the waiting area, her face pale but composed in that way she had of holding herself together when everything was falling apart. "Where is he?" "Room 4. He's awake now. The doctor's with him." Nolan didn't wait for more. He pushed through the double doors into the treatment area, ignoring a nurse who tried to stop him, and found Tyler sitting on an examination table with a bandage on his forehead, looking small and scared. "Dad!" Nolan crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled his son into his arms, holding him tight enough that Tyler squeaked in protest. "You okay? Does it hurt?" "I'm fine. The doctor said I just bumped my head." "He passed out," Nolan's mother said from the doorway. "That's not just a bump." The doctor, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, stepped forward with a clipboard. "Mr. Pierce? I'm Dr. Reyes. Tyler's going to be fine. He has a mild concussion, but the CT scan came back clean. No bleeding, no fractures. He just needs rest and monitoring for the next 24 hours. The relief hit Nolan so hard his knees almost buckled. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. But he'll need to stay home from school for a few days. No screens, no physical activity, just quiet rest." Nolan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Tyler was okay. That was all that mattered. Everything else, The ironworks, the hearing, the 90-day deadline could wait. It was only when he turned around that he realized Celeste was standing in the doorway, her expression careful and uncertain. Tyler noticed her too, his eyes going wide. "Who's that?" "A friend," Nolan said. "Her name's Celeste." Tyler studied her with the kind of directness only kids could pull off. "You're pretty." Celeste smiled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Thank you. You must be Tyler." "Yeah, Dad talks about you sometimes." Nolan felt his face heat. "Tyler, he says you're helping him build something important." "We're helping each other," Celeste said quietly. She looked at Nolan, and something passed between them, an understanding maybe, or just the shared weight of everything they'd been through. "I'm glad you're okay, Tyler." They discharged Tyler an hour later with instructions and a prescription for pain medication if he needed it. Nolan's mother offered to take him home, but Nolan shook his head. "I've got him. Thanks, Ma." "You sure? You look like you haven't slept in a week." "I'm sure." His mother left, and Nolan stood in the parking lot holding Tyler's hand, trying to figure out what came next. He needed to get his son home, needed to make sure he was comfortable and safe. But he also needed to get back to the ironworks, needed to keep pushing forward on the 90-day timeline they'd just been given. "Go," Celeste said. Nolan looked at her. "What?" "Take Tyler home. Be with him. The ironworks can wait." "We've got 90 days. That's not a lot of time." "It's enough for you to take one night off." She reached out, squeezing his arm gently. "He needs you more than I do right now." Nolan wanted to argue, but the truth was she was right. Tyler came first. He always came first. That's what being a father meant, putting your kid above everything else, even the things that mattered. "Okay," he said, "but I'll be back tomorrow." "I know you will." Nolan got Tyler settled at home with a blanket and a pillow on the couch, the TV off per doctor's orders. His son was unusually quiet, picking at the sandwich Nolan had made him, and after a while Nolan sat down beside him. "You want to talk about it?" "About what?" "About being scared." "It's okay if you were." Tyler was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I wasn't scared when I fell. I was scared when I woke up and you weren't there." The words hit Nolan harder than any punch. "I'm sorry. I should have been there." "You were working on the building." "Yeah." "Is it important, the building?" Nolan thought about how to answer that, about how to explain to a 7-year-old why he'd been spending every waking hour trying to save a place that wasn't even his. "It's important to someone I care about," he said finally, "and that makes it important to me." "Celeste?" "Yeah." Tyler was quiet again, his small face serious. "Do you like her?" "I do." "Like how you liked Mom?" Nolan felt his chest tighten. "Different. Better, maybe. I don't know yet." "She seems nice?" "She is." Tyler leaned against Nolan's side, his head resting on his father's shoulder. "I'm glad you have a friend, Dad. You've been sad for a long time." Nolan wrapped an arm around his son, pulling him close. "I'm not sad anymore." "Good." They sat like that for a while, the apartment quiet around them, and Nolan realized something he'd been too busy to see before. He'd spent 2 years believing that survival was enough, that keeping Tyler fed and housed and safe was all he could manage. But his son deserved more than that. He deserved a father who was present, who was happy, who showed him that life was about more than just getting through the day. The ironworks had taught him that. Celeste had taught him that. And now it was time to figure out how to hold on to it. He went back to the ironworks the next morning after making sure Tyler was settled with his mother. Celeste was already there, standing in the middle of the main floor with a clipboard and a measuring tape, looking exhausted but determined. "How is he?" she asked when she saw Nolan. "He's okay, resting." "Good. I'm glad." She handed him the clipboard. "I've been going through the inspection requirements. We need to document every modification we made, get sign-offs from licensed contractors, and submit a full engineering report before the city will even schedule the final inspection." Nolan scanned the list, his stomach sinking. "This is going to take weeks." "I know, but we've got 90 days, remember? We can do this." "Celeste, I know what you're going to say. That we're cutting it close. That we should have started this sooner. But we're here now, and we're going to finish it." Nolan looked at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw and the dark circles under her eyes, and felt something shift in his chest. She was right. They'd come too far to quit now, but he also knew they couldn't do this alone anymore. "We need help," he said. "I know, but we're out of money and favors." "Then we find another way." Nolan pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. "I've got people who owe me. Not money. Time, skills. Let me make some calls." By that afternoon, he'd assembled a small army. Former colleagues who remembered when Nolan had covered their shifts or fixed their mistakes. Contractors who respected him enough to donate a few hours of labor. Even Ray showed up, grumbling about how retirement was supposed to mean not dealing with this kind of chaos. They worked systematically, tackling the inspection requirements one by one. Documentation, sign-offs, engineering reports. It was tedious, unglamorous work that required precision and patience. But slowly, the checklist started shrinking. Celeste worked alongside them, her initial skepticism giving way to something that looked like hope. She learned to coordinate schedules, manage paperwork, negotiate with city officials who were used to people giving up long before this point. She was good at it, better than Nolan had expected, and watching her grow into the role made him realize just how much she'd changed since that first night in the bar. "You're smiling," she said one evening, catching him watching her. "Am I?" "Yeah, why?" Nolan shrugged. "Just thinking about how different things are now, how different you are." "Different how?" "Stronger, more sure of yourself." He paused. "Less alone." Celeste set down the paperwork she'd been reviewing, her expression softening. "I could say the same about you." "Yeah?" "Yeah. When I first met you, you looked like someone who'd forgotten how to want things, like survival was the best you could hope for." She stepped closer. "You don't look like that anymore." "What do I look like?" "Like someone who's building a life instead of just enduring one." The words hung between them, and Nolan felt the weight of everything they'd been avoiding, the long looks, the casual touches, the way his chest tightened whenever she smiled at him. He told himself it didn't matter, that they were just partners in a shared fight. But standing there in the ironworks they'd saved together, he couldn't pretend anymore. "Celeste." "I know," she said quietly. "Me too." 3 weeks before the deadline, Marcus Hale made his move. Nolan was at the ironworks when his phone rang, an unknown number that turned out to be a process server informing him he was being sued for property damage and professional negligence. "What the hell is this?" Nolan asked when he called Celeste. "Hale's suing you personally. He's claiming the sabotage was actually your shoddy construction work and that you've been covering it up." She sounded tired, defeated. "His lawyers filed this morning. They're asking for $2 million in damages." "I don't have $2 million. I don't have 2,000. "I know, that's the point. He's trying to bury you in legal fees so you'll walk away from the project." Nolan felt the anger building, hot and sharp. "He can't do this." "He can, and he is. My lawyer says we can fight it, but it'll take months, maybe years." "We don't have years." "I know." Nolan hung up and stood there in the empty building, feeling the walls close in. Everything they'd built was being attacked from every angle, and he was running out of ways to fight back. The lawsuit was designed to break him, to make him choose between his future and Celeste's. And the worst part was, it might work. But that night, lying in bed unable to sleep, Nolan realized something. Hale's lawsuit was desperate. It was the move of someone who was running out of options, who saw the ironworks getting closer to approval and panicked, which meant they were winning. They just needed to hold on a little longer. He called Celeste at 6 in the morning. "We're not backing down." "Nolan, I mean it. Hale's scared. That's why he's throwing everything at us. But we're too close to quit now." There was a long pause. Then Celeste said, "You could lose everything." "I've already lost everything. This is me building it back." "You're insane." "Probably, but I'm not wrong." Celeste laughed, a sound that was more relief than humor. "Okay, let's finish this." The final 2 weeks were a blur of inspections and paperwork and last-minute fixes. The city sent inspectors almost daily, looking for any excuse to deny the permit. But Nolan and Celeste were ready for them. Every question had an answer. Every concern had been addressed. The building was sound, the documentation complete, the historical designation ironclad. And slowly, grudgingly, the inspectors started signing off. On the morning of the final inspection, Nolan stood outside the ironworks, watching the sunrise paint the brick facade in shades of gold and amber. He'd been here almost every day for 3 months, had poured more time and money and hope into this place than anything else in his life except Tyler. And now it came down to this: one last inspection, one last chance to prove it was worth saving. Celeste appeared at his side, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She passed him one without speaking, and they stood there together in the quiet, watching the city wake up around them. "Whatever happens today," she said finally, "I want you to know what this meant to me. What you meant to me." Nolan looked at her, at the woman who'd gone from a stranger to something he couldn't quite name but knew he didn't want to lose. "We're going to pass." "You don't know that." "Yeah, I do, because we've done everything right, because we've earned this. And if we haven't, then we figure out what comes next, together." The final inspector arrived at 9, a no-nonsense woman named Torres who had a reputation for being fair but unforgiving. She spent 4 hours going through every inch of the building, checking welds, testing load points, reviewing documentation. Nolan and Celeste followed her in silence, answering questions when asked, but otherwise staying out of the way. When Torres finally finished, she stood in the center of the main floor and looked around with an expression Nolan couldn't read. "This is good work," she said finally. "Really good work. You should be proud." Celeste's hands tightened on Nolan's arm. "Does that mean—" "It means I'm approving the permit. The building's safe, the historical designation is valid, and as far as I'm concerned, this project is complete." Torres handed Celeste a stamped document. "Congratulations. You saved it." The words didn't register at first. Nolan just stood there, staring at the document in Celeste's hands, trying to process what he was hearing. They'd done it. After everything, the sabotage, the lawsuits, the impossible deadlines, they'd actually done it. Celeste turned to him, her eyes bright with tears. "We won." "Yeah," Nolan said, his voice rough. "We did." And then she was in his arms, holding him tight, and Nolan felt something break open in his chest, relief and joy, and something deeper, something he'd been too scared to name until now. The news spread fast. By that afternoon, reporters were calling, activists were celebrating, and Marcus Hale's lawyers were scrambling to spin the loss. But Nolan didn't care about any of that. He was too busy standing in the ironworks with Celeste, looking at the building they'd saved and trying to figure out what came next. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "Now that it's yours again." Celeste was quiet for a moment, looking around at the space. "I've been thinking about that, and I have an idea, but I need to know if you're interested." "In what?" "A partnership. You helped me save this place. I want you to help me rebuild it. Turn it into something new. Apartments, maybe, or offices. Something that honors what it was while making it something useful." "You want me to be your partner?" "I want you to be more than that, actually." Celeste stepped closer, her voice dropping. "These last 3 months, working with you, fighting alongside you, it made me realize something. I don't want to do this alone anymore. Any of it." Nolan felt his heart kick against his ribs. "Celeste, I'm not asking you to have all the answers right now. I'm just asking you to think about it, about what we could build together if we wanted to." Nolan thought about Tyler, about the life he'd been trying to build for his son. He thought about the apartment that felt too small and the job that felt too empty and the years he'd spent just trying to survive. And he thought about standing here in this building with this woman feeling more alive than he had in years. "I don't need to think about it," he said. "The answer's yes." Celeste's face lit up. "Really?" "Really. But I've got conditions." "Name them." "Tyler comes first, always. Whatever we build, it has to work for him too." "Done. What else?" "I need time to close out my current job, to figure out logistics. This can't happen overnight." "I know. I'm not expecting it to." Nolan reached out, taking her hands in his. "And I need you to know this isn't just about the business. I'm not good at this kind of thing. Haven't been since my marriage fell apart. But I want to try. With you." Celeste squeezed his hands, her eyes searching his face. "I want that too." They stood there in the quiet, the building settling around them, and Nolan felt something he hadn't felt in years. the sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The lawsuit from Marcus Hale collapsed a week later when evidence surfaced linking his company to the elevator sabotage. Security footage from a neighboring building showed one of Hale's contractors entering the ironworks the night before the collapse, and forensic analysis of the cut cables matched tools found in the contractor's van. Hale denied everything, but the damage was done. The city opened a criminal investigation, and his lawyers quietly withdrew all claims against Nolan and Celeste. Nolan watched the news coverage with a kind of detached satisfaction. Justice felt good, but it wasn't why he'd fought. He'd fought because something was worth saving and because walking away wasn't who he wanted to be anymore. He brought Tyler to the ironworks on a Saturday afternoon, letting his son run through the empty space while he and Celeste talked about renovation plans. "It's really big," Tyler said, his voice echoing off the walls. "It is," Nolan agreed. "Are you going to live here?" "Not here, but I'm going to help Celeste turn it into a place where other people can live." Tyler thought about that for a moment. "Will Celeste live with us?" Nolan glanced at Celeste, who was trying very hard not to smile. "I don't know. Maybe someday. Would you be okay with that?" "Yeah, she's nice, and she makes you happy." "She does." "Then it's okay." Tyler ran off to explore the upper floors, leaving Nolan and Celeste alone. "Someday?" Celeste said, raising an eyebrow. "Too soon?" "No, just right, actually." They started the renovation work the following month. Real work this time, not the desperate scramble to save a condemned building, but the careful, deliberate process of turning it into something new. They hired architects and contractors, got proper permits, did everything by the book. It was slower than the emergency repairs had been, but it was also more satisfying, watching the building transform from a relic into something alive. Nolan quit his job at the commercial firm and threw himself into the project full-time. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, the kind of risk he'd spent years avoiding. But Celeste was there beside him, her business sense balancing his technical expertise, and together they made it work. Tyler adapted better than Nolan had expected. He spent weekends at the ironworks, drawing pictures of what the building would look like when it was finished, asking questions about load-bearing walls and electrical systems. Celeste was patient with him, explaining things in ways he could understand, and slowly Nolan watched his son start to see her not as Dad's friend, but as something more permanent. 6 months after the final inspection, they held a small ceremony to mark the official start of renovations. The mayor was there, along with members of the Historical Preservation Committee and a handful of reporters who'd covered the fight to save the building. Nolan stood at the podium with Celeste beside him, looking out at the crowd, and felt the weight of everything they'd accomplished. "A lot of people told us this building wasn't worth saving," he said, "that we were wasting our time and money on something that was already gone. But standing here now, I think they were wrong. This building represents something important, the idea that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you. That survival isn't the same as surrender, and that sometimes the best things we build are the ones that require us to risk everything." The crowd applauded, and Nolan stepped back, letting Celeste take the microphone. She talked about her father, about his vision for the ironworks, and what it had meant to keep that vision alive. She talked about the community that had rallied behind them, the workers who'd donated their time, the officials who'd chosen to do the right thing instead of the easy thing. And then she looked at Nolan and said, "But most of all, I want to thank the man who stayed when everyone else walked away, who believed in this building even when I wasn't sure I did, who taught me that the best partnerships are built on trust, respect, and a shared refusal to give up." The applause grew louder, and Nolan felt his face heat.